After the death of the Queen Charlotte, Bridgerton was forced to marry. After a large wedding, the young and lively Charlotte was sent directly to marry the King of England, George III. The task was to quickly give birth to a successor. As a result, she found her husband, the handsome king, a bit crazy, hiding from the Lord of Invisibility all day, and there was no fight. Only Charlotte's IQ and EQ were on the line, and the royal rule was to complete this old-fashioned love. The story began in the north of Germany, Milo. As an insignificant small palace, a carriage of England arrived that day. Charlotte was curious and eavesdropped on the conversation between her brother and the messenger. She learned that the messenger came to marry her for the sake of the King of England and for the political alliance to consolidate the status of the family. Her brother signed the marriage contract, which made her furious, but in the end, she couldn't turn a blind eye to the interests of the family. Not long after, she set out for the way of marriage in England. On the way, Charlotte was always unhappy. Her brother tried to comfort her several times, but she was angry with him. Her brother once again declared that the king had chosen her. This is also something that Charlotte didn't understand. Why did the royal family of England let her go? There are so many nobles and nobles around her, but she chose to marry the princess of her own small palace. She thought there must be some hidden reason behind it, and it wouldn't be a good reason. But her brother thought she was thinking too much. Maybe she just fell in love with him. Her brother couldn't stand it, so he stopped the conversation. Charlotte felt more and more uncomfortable. She even wanted the carriage to turn around and go back. Her brother told her not to think too much. She had signed the marriage contract and had to marry. That was the British Empire. And they, as a small palace in Germany, couldn't be enemies with the most powerful country in the world. So there was no choice. And she may never find a better home than the royal family of England. Charlotte had no choice but to accept the reality. After arriving in the Palace of England, the first thing Charlotte saw was her future mother-in-law, the Queen Mother. But the Queen Mother's behavior made her feel very uncomfortable. First, she hit her up and down. Then she showed her teeth and hands. Then she told her clearly that her task was to have a baby. When Charlotte just wanted to say something, she interrupted her. She complained that the dress on her was too much. Let the servants take her to try on the wedding dress. Charlotte held back her tears and smiled. When she tried on the dress, Charlotte asked the maids around her about King George. But no one said a word. They either were speechless or shy. Their reaction made Charlotte feel more and more anxious. The idea of running away from marriage came up again. So she found an excuse to leave the room. Then she quickly walked to the garden. She went around and chose a remote corner. She was going to climb over the wall and escape from this uncomfortable place. At this time, a man walked behind her. He asked her if she needed help. Charlotte tried a few times. She found that she couldn't get out. She thought he was a guard, so she asked him to help her. The man behind her suddenly smiled. Charlotte was a little embarrassed. George didn't care about her rudeness at all. Instead, he smiled forward and took the initiative to introduce himself. Charlotte reacted. After apologizing, she bowed to him. George held her hand and gently held her up. They chatted like this. Surprised, George was attracted by Charlotte's handsome and lively. Charlotte was also moved by George's modesty. At this time, Charlotte's brother came to her. He was surprised to see the king there. George gave Charlotte the right to choose in front of him. It was up to her to decide whether she wanted to stay and finish the wedding. But when she left, she smiled and said goodbye. Looking at her leaving back, Charlotte's idea of running away from marriage gradually disappeared. The wedding scene was full of guests. George looked nervously at the entrance to the church. He wasn't sure if Charlotte would show up. When he was worried, the church door slowly opened. Charlotte was dressed in a gorgeous dress and walked over to him, step by step. George's face was supposed to be nervous and cold. He also slowly smiled. The two stood together in the middle of the church. Under the leadership of the archbishop, they officially became husband and wife.
At the after party, they looked at each other. There was love in their eyes.
After the wedding, after sending away all the guests, George said he would give Charlotte a gift. Then they took a carriage to a place. It was a luxurious palace. Charlotte was confused. Shouldn't they live together? George explained calmly. He would live in another palace. Even so, Charlotte still didn't want to ruin the atmosphere tonight. He reminded George that tonight was their wedding night. But George thought he was fulfilling his duty as a husband. His face suddenly sank. He wanted to say something, but he didn't say it. He turned around and walked into the house. Charlotte couldn't help but follow him. She noticed that George was angry. Charlotte was a little confused. She didn't know why. Faced with his careful interrogation, George avoided the topic. He never gave a reason. His emotions became more and more irritable. After a short talk, Charlotte opened her mouth. George wanted to explain, but it became a sentence in his mouth. "This is the best." Charlotte agreed politely. On the wedding night, they left without a word. After returning to the room, Charlotte still couldn't figure it out. It was supposed to be a sweet honeymoon, but she never saw her husband again. She lived like this every day. She was served by servants to get up and eat, but every day she looked at the empty seat opposite. She felt more and more lonely. On this day, Charlotte couldn't help but come to George's palace. She wanted to ask. She was told by the attendants at the door. George went to the astronomy table. She asked the attendants to wait. She went alone. When she saw him coming, George happily shared his observations with her. After knowing the wedding, she stayed here all the time. Charlotte was even more confused. She asked if she had done something wrong. She even thought that George had gone to the brothel. She didn't even think of leaving herself here to watch the stars. George said he didn't do anything wrong. He told her not to think about it. Charlotte was even angrier. She was trapped in that house. No one could speak. No one could do anything. She was not allowed to go out. She was not allowed to make friends. Faced with her anger and questions, George still refused to give her any answers, but insisted that she go back. Charlotte was wronged and said goodbye. They left without a word again. The next morning, George and Charlotte's attendants were summoned by the Queen Mother to ask about the situation. Of course, they were most concerned about whether they were wronged and whether they could give birth to a successor for the royal family as soon as possible. In order to cover up for the master, they had to give a reassuring answer to the people. After leaving, the two became restless. They lied in front of the Queen Mother. They could only find a way to promote the relationship between the king and the queen. The next day, when Charlotte was distracted in the park, George sent someone a note. Charlotte happily ran over. She found it was a puppy. But she didn't seem to like this skinny puppy. She thought it looked like a rabbit. After a few glances, she gave it to the attendants. In order to ease her boredom, the attendants kindly reminded her to find someone to talk to. Just be careful. Charlotte thought of Mrs. Dan, whom she met at the wedding. They didn't say a word when they met. Mrs. Dan saw that Charlotte and George were not married yet. She took a pen and wrote a letter to them. The news of their meeting soon spread to the Queen Mother's ears. She immediately called Mrs. Dan and asked her what she had talked about with the Queen. Mrs. Dan did not reveal that they were not married yet. She said it was just a little chat. The Queen Mother did not ask. Instead, she wanted her to stay by the Queen's side and become her own puppet. Mrs. Dan took the opportunity to make her own request. She and her husband came from the king's family of Saladian. Although they are wealthier than most of the top social members here, they still do not get respect. In the end, the two of them reached an agreement. On Charlotte's side, according to the daily routine, she wore good clothes and went out to eat. Unexpectedly, George came. She was not happy at all. Instead, she turned around and left the restaurant angrily. George followed her and chased her up. After dinner, George changed his avoidance. He took the initiative to take her to the astronomy table to look at the stars and introduce his research to her. He solemnly apologized for ruining the wedding night and hoped to start over with her to make up for the wasted time. In the end, George moved into Charlotte's palace. Charlotte put on a beautiful robe. George looked at her and kissed her. The two of them had their first night after marriage. The next morning, when Charlotte woke up from bed, she found George not by her side. He thought he went out for a walk and was ready to go to the restaurant with the puppy and wait for him to come back for dinner, but she accidentally heard the conversation between George and the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother reminded her that her marriage was a palace affair, a council affair, and a matter of the whole country. George was infuriated by her words that it was not allowed to make any mistakes. Because the Queen Mother was getting married, she got married. Because of the Queen Mother, Charlotte couldn't know her situation. She didn't say anything either. Charlotte turned around sadly and left. It turned out that everything that happened yesterday was not true. It was just to stabilize the royal dog. And in the room, after the Queen Mother left, George suddenly breathed heavily and his hands trembled uncontrollably. On the day of the wedding, Charlotte's servant Brie ran into George's servant Reynolds in the kitchen downstairs. Faced with the interrogation, Reynolds said he had something to do. Brie didn't ask any more questions. However, when she turned around and left, she accidentally saw George and the doctor in the cellar. Reynolds was shocked and immediately blocked her. Brie thought something was wrong, but seeing Reynolds' serious expression, she left here in a hurry. At the wedding ceremony of Charlotte, George was with her. In public, they were very loving. Receiving the blessings of the people, they could go back to the palace and close the door. The two of them let go of each other's hands and went back to their rooms. When the Queen Mother heard it in silence, Brie asked her to give birth to the heir of the royal family as soon as possible. When she reported to the Queen Mother, she also tried to cover her eyes. In order to give birth to the heir as soon as possible and complete their mission, Charlotte and George reached an agreement. Every few days, the two of them worked together. They didn't bother each other at other times. On the day of the meal, Charlotte looked at George, who was on the other side, and the more she thought about it, the less she breathed. George didn't dare to show weakness. George directly said his own doubts. Wasn't he fine when he moved in? Why did he change his face the next day? Charlotte didn't say it directly. The two of them quarreled again. The atmosphere was getting more and more tense. The servants on one side didn't dare to come out. After a short silence, George suddenly stood up and walked towards Charlotte. After looking at each other, the two of them kissed directly. As the two of them kissed more and more, Reynolds and Brie took all the servants and left the room in time and closed the door carefully. After that, the two of them still had a hard mouth and didn't say a word to each other, but occasionally the two of them remembered kissing more than anyone else. And every time after the routine work with George, Charlotte would complain to Mrs. Danbury that she hated George so much. But every time she talked about the details of their relationship, she would show a smile unconsciously. Brie also noticed that Charlotte was in a much better mood than before. She couldn't help but tell him about George's visit to the doctor. The next few days, Charlotte hesitated for a long time and asked him if he was feeling unwell recently. Why did he secretly visit the doctor in the cellar? George felt a little guilty after hearing it. He lied that it was just a routine check. The royal family had to be checked every day at home. Charlotte didn't believe this statement at all. Why didn't the doctor go to the cellar in the check room? But George always denied it. This made Charlotte more and more suspicious. She began to secretly observe George's every move. She found that he was leading his servants out early in the morning. When he came back, he was covered with mud. Faced with the question, George said a little unnaturally, he went to the garden to plant vegetables and wanted to see if he could grow better vegetables. At first, Charlotte didn't believe it and thought it was an excuse he was looking for. But when he went to the garden, he really saw the melon and fruit vegetables in George's mouth. He didn't know that George was lying. He finally began to understand George a little. Another few days later, he chose to open his heart to George and mentioned that George had always lived for the country. The fact was that he had no choice but to stay in the garden for so long every day. George didn't cover his eyes. In the garden, he felt like he was living like a person. Other times, he was an exhibition item. George was moved by his words. The two of them completely let go of their previous unhappiness and no longer cared about the days of chicken and duck. They began a normal married life. George was invited by Charlotte to attend the first dance party. But the peaceful days didn't last long. One late night, Charlotte was woken up by a strange sound in the room. She found that George was not around. She took the light to check and saw George drawing something on the wall. She was surprised and said something. Charlotte didn't react yet. George had already found her. She turned around subconsciously and wanted to run away. Charlotte ran after her. The office staff immediately notified Reynolds. The department staff didn't know the reason, but they still did it. At this time, George ran all the way to the park and took off all his clothes. He knelt on the ground naked. Charlotte looked at the scene and stood still. After the reaction, she took the clothes in Reynolds' hands and called his name and helped him put on his clothes. She took him back to his room and helped him wash his body. Charlotte asked Reynolds what was going on. It turned out that George was a man who was passionate about science and agriculture and often studied new ways of farming with the nomads. But every time he was almost forcibly summoned by the Queen Mother to force her to marry a successor out of insecurity.
George did not agree with this approach. He wanted to rule the country in his own way through actual scientific research. But the Queen Mother still took out the national righteousness and forcibly persuaded him to obey. The long-term mental pressure gradually lost control of George's emotions and eventually led to mental illness. When he was ill for the first time, George said to himself in a mad voice that the Queen Mother immediately dismissed everyone and later found all the famous doctors in the country to treat him. But these doctors discussed with George for a long time and could not say why. Some said the body was weak. Some said the pressure was too great. Only a doctor named John said what others dare not say. But he determined that there was something wrong with the king's spirit. This was almost equivalent to treason. But John said that it was just a nervous disorder that he could cure. After experiencing too much disappointment, the Queen Mother decided to grab the last hope and agreed to let him try. John walked straight to George and let him look at his own eyes. He kept using a gentle tone to give him psychological hints. Unexpectedly, under his guidance, George's emotions gradually stabilized and gradually restored his mind. After that, John was appointed as the king's private doctor and was fully responsible for George's treatment. On the day of the wedding, George heard that Charlotte was missing and his spirit became unstable for a moment. He was shaking and wanted to get out of here. John blocked him behind the church. After psychological hint was useless, he raised his hand and gave him a slap. And this slap pulled George out of the confusion and escape. Finally, George came to the park to get some air. He met Charlotte for the first time. Then the wedding was over. He was worried that he would get sick and hurt Charlotte. He had a bad temper with her and they broke up on their wedding night. In the following days, George has been hiding in the astronomy table and dare not see Charlotte. Reynolds couldn't help persuading him. This would only make the Queen sadder. Until Charlotte took the initiative to come to the astronomy table to find him. Listening to him talking about all the grievances he had here, looking at his sad back, George realized that his escape brought more harm to Charlotte. So the next day he came to John and hoped that he could get better soon and not get sick again. He could accept the more radical method. He wanted to live a normal life with Charlotte. At first, John was a little hesitant. The radical treatment method would cause a great harm to the body, but George's attitude was firm. John agreed in time because he was also studying radical methods recently. The so-called treatment started the next morning. John rushed into George's bedroom with a few assistants. Before he could react, he forcibly took him out of the bedroom. First, George sat in the bathtub and kept adding ice cubes to it. Then he pressed his head into the water again and again and made him struggle on the edge of suffocation. In addition to physical torture, food was also strictly controlled. It was hard to swallow. Soon after, John took George down and placed him in various abandoned basements. John thought that George's disease was mainly because he had never learned to surrender and was not bound by anything. It would lead to confusion in his mind. So he locked George in a chair and told him mercilessly that he was not the king here. After a mental breakdown, there was a series of physical torture. Over the next few days, George's body became weaker and weaker. In a treatment, he couldn't bear the pain and stopped the treatment. He asked John how long such a day would last. Their goal was to get him back to normal. As it went on, he would lose his life in a few days.
John told him the reason why this treatment method is called wonderful is because fear is the basis of this method. Once you overcome fear, the end is good. If he gave up now, all his previous efforts would be in vain. George remembered Charlotte and compromised again. Reynolds didn't know the specific treatment method, but he was still a little worried when he saw the ice cubes and George's food coming from far away. While the treatment was going on, George came to the top of the palace and secretly observed Charlotte's every move. He watched her play chess alone in the garden and eat alone. George suddenly remembered a move and brought Reynolds to John's laboratory and took out the puppy from the cage. But he didn't expect that Charlotte took the puppy as a chicken-shaped rabbit. And soon after, George received a note from Queen Mother Wang. He didn't need treatment today. And he was in a better mood recently. George decided to see Charlotte and have dinner with her. But while waiting for Charlotte, he was too nervous and his body began to tremble uncontrollably. Reynolds found something strange behind him and gently pressed his shoulder. George slowly calmed down. Then he took Charlotte to the observatory and moved in. The two of them got along well. Later, Charlotte found out that he went to the garden to plant vegetables. They completely opened their hearts. George's condition stabilized for a while. The two of them also had a sweet time, so he asked John to terminate the treatment. Unexpectedly, one night, George accidentally saw John in the kitchen. John took the initiative to explain that it was Queen Mother Wang who sent him here. The queen may be pregnant. He came to prepare the prenatal medicine. When he heard this news, George's smile gradually solidified. When he turned around and saw Charlotte sleeping on the bed, he began to be afraid that his illness would be passed on to the child.
Under great mental pressure and fear, he lost his mind again and painted and drew on the wall, until Charlotte was woken up by the noise. She fled to the garden. Then Charlotte took her back to her room to clean up the scene. The next morning, George woke up from the chaos. He found Charlotte was not around. When he got up and saw the mess on the wall, he realized that he was sick again last night. At this time, there was a sound of a carriage outside the window. George rushed to the window and happened to see Charlotte leaving in a carriage. He panicked and immediately called Reynolds. Charlotte came to the palace with a cold face and rushed straight into Queen Mother Wang's room. After knowing everything, Charlotte opened the door and asked him if George had a mental illness. Why did she hide such a big thing from herself? Queen Mother Wang, who was struck by pain, immediately refuted that George was emotionally unstable because he was under too much pressure to govern the country. This is at most a shortcoming. Queen Mother Wang made him realize the reality. She was just a princess who didn't care about the country. Now she has become the leader of the world. What's wrong with her husband being a little weird? Charlotte refuted that she did not ask to control the world. She only asked the man she married to be a real man, who she could get to know, and not a lie hidden by bugs. And their conversation was heard by George, who followed her outside the door. She lost her mind and turned to John. He struck her back. For a while, he wrote a lot of letters to George, but he never received a reply. He thought George was avoiding himself on purpose, and he felt more and more disappointed. At this time, the Empress Dowager came with the royal doctor. The trip was to determine whether Charlotte was really pregnant. After a checkup, the doctor reported to the Empress Dowager that the Queen was pregnant. The Empress Dowager was delighted and immediately asked someone to bring her things over. She wanted to be with Charlotte all the time, but Charlotte was never happy. I don't know. I still write to George as usual, but what he doesn't know is that George never received his letter. John, in order to better control George, does not allow the outside world to have any contact with him. Even Reynolds was blocked outside the door. All the letters were piled up, and Charlotte not only had no news of George, but also was monitored by the Empress Dowager all the time. The diet was strictly managed, and even the skin color on her portrait was decided by the Empress Dowager. The idea of escaping again made Charlotte desperate and hopeless. When she returned to her room, she wrote a letter to her brother and told him that she was pregnant, and asked him to come to England as soon as possible. Responsible for the letter was worried about the content of the letter. He knew that Charlotte wanted to leave, so he came to Reynolds, hoping that he could persuade George to meet Charlotte. Soon my brother arrived in England and learned that his sister was pregnant. He was very happy, and after a brief talk with her, Charlotte asked him to take her away. He had fulfilled his brother's order to marry England, and now he just wanted to go home. But his brother refused. He is now pregnant with the heir of England, and leaving is equivalent to treason, which will lead to war. My brother also told him about another reason. They signed a marriage agreement with England and became allies, which meant that the British Empire would protect the security of their country.
Charlotte only realized that she had no way out, but gradually calmed down at dinner at night. At that time, there was no expression on the whole city, listening to the conversation between Empress Dowager Wang and her brother. Empress Dowager Wang even comforted him as long as he gave birth to the heir. Even if he has fulfilled his responsibility, if George doesn't want to see him, he doesn't have to see him, unless they need to give birth to another heir. Charlotte suddenly realized that she and George, even the baby in her belly, were just tools to stabilize the king's power. When the meal was over, she gradually collapsed. The body was also a little unstable and swaying to the left and right, and she noticed that she was in the wrong place and came to see Reynolds. I hope he can persuade George to see Charlotte. And Reynolds has not seen George for a few days and is worried about an accident. He broke into the basement regardless of John's obstruction and looked forward to George being pressed into the water over and over again. He was angry and wanted to stop it, and Charlotte left for the park and looked forward to a deserted vegetable garden. She was a little annoyed and didn't want to stay in the palace, so she came to Mrs. Dan's house alone. I was going to stay here, but Mrs. Dan didn't dare to risk the future heir and sent someone to inform the White Golden Palace and persuaded Charlotte to go back under his guidance. Charlotte understands that they can live the life they want, and she is the queen and has her own responsibility. She decided to take the initiative to find George at the door of the palace, but was stopped by John outside the door. Reynolds raised his hand and pointed in the direction of Charlotte. When he came to the treatment room, Charlotte saw George being treated with pain. George, who was angry and stopped the people inside, hugged George, who was out of his mind, and kept calling his name. When he slowly regained his mind, he was taken back to his room. After going out, John tried to persuade him that, although the process was a little painful, it could restore the king's mental health. Then let John pack up and leave. John accused him of hurting him. "Be grateful, I do not order you destroyed." Finally, he asked the servant to bring his things here. He wanted to take care of George in person. And after George regained consciousness, he was afraid he would hurt Charlotte and the child, persuade him to stay away from himself, and see him unwillingly and heartlessly say a lot of hurtful words. This time, no matter how bad he speaks, Charlotte has always insisted on staying. George once again declared to him that he was a madman. He could not control the idea in his head that no one would want to be with him. George could no longer pretend to speak to him. From the moment he saw Charlotte trying to climb over the wall, he fell in love with her. Without her by his side, he even felt that he could not breathe. Until this moment, the two of them finally understood the deep love between them. They lived in peace and happiness for a while. On this day, Empress Dowager Wang suddenly visited Charlotte on behalf of George to see him. Empress Dowager Wang hopes that Charlotte understands that George is the king from birth. She has nowhere to hide, she has her country, her people, and her duty. He has done his best to ensure his throne, but the cabinet and the people around him are still staring at him. At the end of the meeting, Charlotte came to George for a parliament speech. He had to attend to give the people an explanation. The next day, they returned to the White Golden Palace together. George was writing his speech seriously. Charlotte was with him. Suddenly, Charlotte felt a tremor in her abdomen. She was sent back to her room in a hurry. Listening to the screaming inside, George rushed in regardless of the patriarch's obstruction. Charlotte's miscarriage led to a miscarriage. The doctor on site said that he would wait for the fetus to be naturally corrected. George knew that if he did not take action, Charlotte might lose too much blood and die. So he made Charlotte believe in himself and then tried to save the worker with the Mars to save the miscarriage. Fortunately, their child was born smoothly, and the Wang family also welcomed the heir. It was shortly after George's speech, because he was so nervous that his hands couldn't help shaking. Charlotte comforted him. After that, she left with Reynolds, but when he arrived at the parliament, he hid in the carriage because he was nervous and refused to come out. Unfortunately, Reynolds took him back to his place. Charlotte, who had received the news, hurried to check the situation and found George hiding under the bed. Charlotte lay down to accompany him. After calming him down, they began to discuss the impact of the miscarriage and decided to hold a ball in the White Golden Palace. Soon, the invitation was sent to the noble's residence. Before the dinner began, George's hands began to tremble unconsciously. Reynolds wanted to go up, but was stopped by Brie. Then, Charlotte held George in her arms and came to the ball. The nobles and members of the parliament arrived, and George began to get nervous. George finally overcame his fear, and Charlotte finished a dance with the help of everyone, and then successfully gave a speech. Many years later, the Queen of Charlotte and the King of George's pregnant 13 children grew up to know that their daughter-in-law was pregnant and the Wang family was about to have a new heir. He couldn't wait to tell George. George was getting worse and worse and couldn't even recognize Charlotte. Charlotte lay in bed like she did before, and George lay in bed and recognized her. The two of them were lying here looking at each other. As soon as the camera turned, they saw each other when they were young. The Queen of Charlotte ended there. As the prequel to Bridgerton, Charlotte had a sincere and passionate relationship. So when Daphne and Anthony met true love and broke her engagement, she had no blame or embarrassment, but was truly happy for them.